Well, now comes my favorite part of these things, which is the period where there's interaction, because I think, this is really a group process. Every one of you, to some degree, has taken upon yourself the role of the Magellan in the living room, and probably everyone in this room has at some time or another gazed upon things no other human eye has ever beheld. And, the psychedelic dimension is not yet a science. We're more like explorers, comparing our crudely drawn maps and hastily scrawled journal notes to try and together get a picture of this new continent in the imagination. So, I'm yours, sir.
You have said in your book about that the mushroom was genetically engineered for producing psilocybin by alien intelligence. What do you think now about the possibility of us making that again, putting those genes producing psilocybin in other kind of organisms like fungi or plants, or I don't know, about animals?
Oh, well, interesting question. I think it's the question was, I've described the mushroom as genetically engineered by some other agency for the production of psilocybin. What do I think about the possibility of human beings being able to genetically manipulate organisms to produce psychedelic compounds? I think that the technology and theory has reached the stage where if there's an enterprising graduate student within the sound of my voice, the way to go is to locate the gene for psilocybin in the mushroom genome and to translate it via standard techniques to E. coli, to Escherichia coli, and then you would have a easily grown bacterium, which would be a chemical factory for pouring out psilocybin. So, if any of you are aspiring genetic pharmacologists, this would be a fine thing. I might elaborate on the answer, some of you who are not familiar with the premise. The reason I suggested that the mushroom might have been engineered and be in fact an artifact of an alien intelligence was, number one, of course, the informational content of the trip, but number two, the fact that psilocybin is 4-phosphoryloxy-N,N-dimethyltryptamine, the only 4-phosphorylated indole known to occur in nature, Out of thousands and thousands of compounds and organisms, only one 4-phosphorylated compound is known. So this suggests that it is artificial, or at least highly unusual. Every week, the science magazines are full of talk of strategies for locating and identifying extraterrestrial life. Well, a very obvious, practical, and scientifically reasonable way to proceed would be to look at the DNA of various life forms on Earth and see if there are any where there is a wild statistical departure from the norm. And whenever you get an organism which is producing or has genes that no other organism has, this is highly suggestive, because evolutionary types evolve incrementally out of each other. So you would expect that there would be a relative smoothness in the expression of genetic products, that one fungus would be rather like its taxonomic near relatives. One menosperm or member of the Rubiaceae would be chemically similar to another. In fact, of course, we do find subtle chemical variations, but the presence of a 4-phosphorylated indole in a fungus like that is very suggestive. And there's an interesting book by Cyril Punampurama called Perspectives on the Problem of Extraterrestrial Communication. And he outlines there what he believes would be a general strategy for extraterrestrial contact that any kind of species would have to operate against if it were to seriously conduct a search through space. And the model has a ship which, at a certain distance from its origin planet, it must replicate itself. And then at a certain distance, replicate again. And then again, in order to keep the density of ships constant as the sphere of the area being explored expands, there have to be more and more of these ships. And these ships could be as small as a human, as a animal cell. They don't have to be thought of as Star Trek type ships. But the point is, this ship contains a message that you have to read and call in, because there are so many planets and star systems to be surveyed that the only way such a survey could be conducted is if there were a message in the ship qua organism, such that in the gene swarm of an alien planet, it would eventually be read by an organism on this planet, and that organism would act to do the things necessary to call the central switchboard, and then they would say, aha, we have contact in sector alpha sub n 362, and they would concentrate all their attention there. The biological world that we assume to be natural may in fact be the artifacts of a much higher intelligence. Here.
Yes, would you speak on the timeline a little?
Oh, what a kind questioner. To lead me to my favorite subject. Well, it has to do with why, people do this for different reasons, why people take psychedelic plants and what lies behind it always. And what always lay behind it for me, from that very first DMT trip that I described to you at the beginning, was the notion, my God, this stuff has historical significance. It's really important, or nobody knows about this. Carrying with it the notion we are discovering it. If we could bring it back somehow, it would change the world. Perhaps people are bringing it back by designing buildings and creating fashions or fashioning mathematical descriptions of reality. I never had that aspiration. I just simply defined myself as more humbly than that, as a consumer of ideology, as an intellectual who would learn what has been said and done and proposed. But after the DMT experience, I realized that there is unclaimed stuff out in those dimensions. James Joyce says in Finnegan's Wake, up nient prospector, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. Well, the key word is prospector. A prospector is a rock hunter. I wanted to prospect for the alchemical stone, for the lapis philosophorum, and I conceived it as an idea. And the timeline, I think it would come differently for each of us. For me, it was this incredibly formal, aesthetically symmetrical, and therefore satisfying idea about what time is. That the Tao is something which could be mathematically described as a flux of a quality in time, a quality that I named novelty. And once I had enunciated it for myself, I saw that that was the part of the world that we have no description for. Science gives us descriptions for what is possible, but we have no descriptions for what, out of the set of the possible, undergoes the actual formality of occurring. Why are certain things selected to come to be? And I saw then the notion of the Tao, which is generally presented as a kind of intuitive notion. You're not supposed to demand too much hard-edged clarity. You say, just flow with it, man, you know, flow with it. Well, when someone says flow to me, I think of equations which would describe flow. Flow as a dynamical system, which therefore can be mathematically modeled. And what the timeline is a seeing that the very largest patterns which describe the whole birth, evolution, and death of the universe are repeated at successively shorter and shorter spans of time, and down into the quantum mechanically and microelectronically cognizable realms of time, the realm of the nano and the picoseconds. And studying the I Ching, which I saw then as a kind of phenomenological description of time produced by the Oriental mind, completely unencumbered by our particular set of cultural conventions. I mean, certainly having its own set of peculiar conventions, but not ours, that there is a pattern in nature, not in three-dimensional space, but in time, a pattern in time on many levels that reproduces itself and can be known, can be formally described, and once known, can be seen to control the ebb and flow of connectedness, or the forward and backward surge of novelty. And I thought that this was a great insight. Since it was the only one I had, I could hardly sell it short. And what pleased me most about it was, you know, a rap is a rap. It's as good as the rapper. But here was a mathematically formal idea that could stand on its own, be examined in the absence of the rapper, be examined by critics who were as hostile as they cared to be. It's a tool. It's in a long line of tools that stretches back toward the first chipped flint and stretches forward toward the soul made manifest as starship and alchemical transformation. But it was the tool that I came upon, and they all, you know, what is always put against the psychedelic experiences, they say, well, big deal, what's ever come out of it, you know? So I was pleased that here was a concrete notion that came out of it. Richard?
Yes, along the line of this time wave, can you give us a reading of our current time in the not-too-distant future?
I would be only too happy to. The question is, would I care to prophesy based on this timeline? Yes, one of the assumptions built into the theory is that time is a series of nested resonances, and that each time is composed of resonance with previous and future times on varying levels. The time we are living through, I call the Roman twilight, simply because we are living through a period that is in resonance with the time of the last Roman emperors. And I think if you look at it carefully, you can begin to see the way this theory proposes to be analogical and yet formal at the same time. What was happening in the decades immediately preceding the fall of Rome? A progressively weakened series of self-indulgent propagandists ruled the greatest empire on earth with a more and more shaky hand. as they succumb to gonorrhea, mercuric poisoning, various occult pursuits, millenarian obsessions, and so forth. Meanwhile, in the East, in Byzantium, a new civilization was unleashing itself. And if you think of those events which unfolded over a few hundred years as telescoped into a few years in our own era, you see that with the rise of Gorbachev and the continued mismanagement of the American empire under the crypto-fascist series of rotating bimbos and buffoons that we have suffered through, that what is happening is an empire is being betrayed into eclipse by self-indulgence and stupidity and bad management, and its cultural adversary is in ascendancy. Now, Byzantium never conquered Rome. It doesn't happen like that. But what ended was the Roman world of indulgent, cohesive imperialism. And what it was replaced with was a rise in religious fundamentalism, a stricter and more Puritan kind of morality, the rise of epidemic diseases, and a vast economic retrenchment, which initiated what we call the Dark Ages. Now, in the present situation of the 20th century, these themes are being recapitulated at an extremely rapid rate. So their dark age is for us a tough 3 or 4 years, fortunately. You know, it's said history occurs first as tragedy, then as farce. We are the heirs of the vast tragedy of extended history who live through the curiously mediaized and dehumanized farce of the recapitulation of these themes, so that, because the very notion that the last 10 Roman emperors could be symbolized by someone like the present chief executive cannot fail to bring a small smile to any open mind, I think. So what I see happening between, or over the next 24 years, really, is first this retrenchment, which, hell, it may be upon us, judging by the market's performance Thursday and Friday. I may not be doing prophecy at all. This may be recap at this point. But whether that is a technical move or the actual beginning of the unraveling of the overbought Western capitalistic system, I can't say. But I will say that by 1989, by mid-1989, by the time the next presidential ritual has been enacted, it will be clear, I think, that we have entered into a whole new kind of temporal domain, a kind of temporal domain that will appear superficially to be fairly bleak, because what it will be highly chaotic, highly novel, and tending to oscillate wildly around a mean. So in other words, there will be no clear trend visible. There will appear to be progressive surges and then losing of ground, and then progressive surges and losing of ground. And this will go on through till the mid-90s. Around 1996, 97, the resonance pattern will have shifted, and we will be occupying a relationship to the late high Middle Ages and the emergence of the new social forms created by the emergence of the mercantile class and the bourgeois. In other words, private wealth, cities, end of cultural insularity, a restarting of the economic machinery, and a kind of new flowering, but still under the shadow of these fundamentalist forces that will have come into ascendancy in the previous Dark Age. Then, in 1998, we come into that area which is in resonance with the period of the discovery of the New World, 1492, in other words, and the exploration of the New World and its subjugation over about 150 years, which followed from that, will be what will be going on as we close out the millennium. What the discovery of the New World will mean in terms of our reenactment of these great themes is anybody's guess. It could be the vindication of my style of rap, a nearby inhabited dimension filled with alien intelligence. Or it may be the vindication of a more orthodox sort of expectation of extraterrestrial contact, or perhaps ultimately the launching of large telescopes into orbit, which will confirm for us the existence of oxygen-rich, water-heavy worlds around nearby stars. I mean, that alone would make an intellectual revolution that would leave our world unrecognizable to itself. We have to recall that as recently as 500 years ago, the continent that we're inhabiting was unknown. It was something talked of by wild-eyed dreamers. You know, it was an impossibility, a psychedelic dimension. Everyone knew that when you sailed west far enough, there'd be monsters, and that was the end of it. It was literally the unconscious. Now, you know, we deal in the real estate of that unconscious, and there is no reason why our children should not deal in the real estate of the psychedelic of the psychedelic dimension that we are discovering and confirming over the next 10 years or so. Let me carry this through to the end, because the good part comes at the end. After the turn of the century, the acceleration of the unfolding of these resonances becomes more and more intense, and eventually we reach the supercompression of modern times. This is why I proposed to you last night the term compressionist for this school of thought that myself and Sheldrake and Frank Barr and Ralph Abraham represent, because we all are talking about the dense nesting of concrescent systems, and ultimately, in my own point of view, the emergence of a transcendental object at the end of time. And the end of time is not far off. As Joyce says in The Wake, it may not be as far off as ye wish to be congealed. It is, I think, within the lifetimes of all of us, there will be an ontological transformation of the human mode. So I think the transcendental object is emerging. Once it has emerged, there will be no big deal about it, in the same way that we look back at the emergence of language, and nobody jumps around or gets excited about it, or only a few philosophers do. And yet the fact that we possess language is the thumbprint of God upon our species. It's an impossible break with previous animal organization. I mean, you can talk all you want about Coco the talking gorilla and this and that. I mean, but then you turn to a poem by Andrew Marvell, and you realize, you know, there is an ontological break here. There is not an even progress. As we anticipate this thing, it could be anything. It could be the visible language that I indicated as a possibility earlier this evening. It could be emergence in an extraterrestrial mind. It could be the transcendental emergence of all and everything, the Tao made flesh, the actual collapse of the state vector into some kind of mysterious completion. But it's much more rational to place this kind of singularity at the end of a complex evolutionary process like the life of the universe than at the beginning, which is the scientific approach, to just say, well, everything sprang from nothing for no reason in a single instant, and please don't ask questions about that, because our map begins 1/10 trillionth of a picosecond after that happened. We don't talk about that. Well, isn't this somewhat begging the question for an intellectual enterprise that purports to offer an explanation of how things came to be? So the transcendental object, which suggests to me a negative casuistry, a purpose in the universe that is focusing and drawing everything toward it. And in fact, I've said, history is the shock wave of eschatology. History, which lasts 10,000 years, is this microsecond of ultra-complex experience where the penetration of the natural world by the transcendental object each exists contemporaneous with the other for a historical or geological microsecond. And then the two terms are merged and all opposites are dissolved, and somehow the gift is claimed, the pearl is restored, and the project is ended. We are living through that moment, a 10,000-year rush from chipping of stone flint to walking through the violet doorway of a self-generated hyperdimensional vehicle that carries us to our true home. No wonder it leaves an explosive set of eddies in its wake. I said last night, this is what happens when a culture prepares to depart for the stars. This is not business as usual. This is something else entirely. And it's the intellectual adventure and challenge of our time for each of us to understand this in terms relevant to ourselves and the people immediately around us. And so this is the inspiration for Time Wave Zero. This is what it maps. This is the odd thing in the map, that when the time map came through, it wasn't only a map of historical process, but there was the transcendental object mapped into it, and all of its sub-reflections could be seen. This is what Christ was about. This is what Buddha was about. This is what your most enlightened moment was about. You, each of you, and me. It is, the hyperdimensional particulate reflection of Godhead scattered back through the flatter plane of this lower dimensional slice of experience. I mean, it's hard to say it any clearer than that. Here.